Space exploration has been a driving force in the scientific community, mostly because of the space race that began in the 1960s. Since then, exploring space has become less of a dream and continues to become more and more achievable with the help of quickly growing technology. I will begin by speaking about several people and missions that helped lay the foundation for the future of space travel. Then we will dive deeper into the space race and other countries that have made some very noble achievements during this time, along with future plans for further exploration of space. The first successful manned space mission was launched by Russia on April 12, 1961, carrying a young man known as Yuri Gagarin. The spacecraft was Vostok 1 and it orbited around the Earth in 1 hour and 48 minutes. About a month later, the United States sent their first astronaut into space, Alan Shepard Jr., on a 15-minute, 22-second suborbital flight in a spacecraft called Freedom 7. He was also the fifth man to walk on the moon and the first to play lunar golf. Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova was launched aboard Vostok 6 on June 16, 1963, and became the first woman to fly in space. During the roughly 70-hour flight, Vostok 6 made 48 orbits of Earth. Upon completion of her mission, Tereshkova was honored with the title Hero of the Soviet Union. She never flew again, but she did become a spokesperson for the Soviet Union. While fulfilling this role, she received the United Nations Gold Medal of Peace. The USA couldn't take being beaten by the Soviets, so Neil Armstrong and his crew in the Apollo 11 made a safe landing on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong proceeded to make the first moonwalk. This great achievement catapulted America ahead in the space race. Aldrin and Armstrong's spacewalk lasted 2 hours and 36 minutes, and they collected 48.5 pounds of material from the surface, including 50 moon rocks, as well as deploying experiments, planting the U.S. flag, and taking a moment to speak with then U.S. President Richard Nixon. Sally Ride later became the first American woman to go into space when she flew on the Space Shuttle Challenger on June 18, 1983. According to NASA official Brian Dunbar, Project Mercury, the first U.S. program to put humans in space, made 25 flights, 6 of which carried astronauts between 1961 and 1963. The objectives of the program were to orbit a human spacecraft around Earth, to investigate a person's ability to function in space, and to recover both the astronaut and spacecraft safely. Mercury showed that humans could function for periods up to 34 hours of weightless flight. On April 9, 1959, NASA introduced its first astronaut class, called the Original Seven. This team consisted of Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and Gordon Cooper. The Gemini program primarily tested equipment and mission procedures and trained astronauts and ground crews for future Apollo missions to the moon. The program's main goals were to test an astronaut's ability to fly long-duration flights, to understand how a spacecraft could rendezvous and dock with another vehicle in Earth orbit, to perfect re-entry landing methods, and to further understand the effects of longer space flights on astronauts. About 8 years after President Kennedy challenged Americans to reach for the moon, Project Apollo landed the first humans on the lunar surface and returned them safely to Earth. The Apollo program also developed technology to meet other national interests in space, conducted scientific exploration of the moon, and developed humanity's capability to work in the lunar environment. Tragedy struck the Apollo program when, on January 27, 1967, fire swept through the Apollo 1 command module during a pre-flight test on the Cape Kennedy launch pad. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives. NASA was not deterred, but rather changed how things were done to ensure the safety and success of future missions. After an oxygen tank explosion aboard the Apollo 13, the ground crew made a prototype device that would remove carbon dioxide from the module, which the crew on the module made, and used the Apollo 13 as a sort of lifeboat to take them safely back to Earth on April 17, 1970. In 1973, Skylab expeditions paved the way for the International Space Station. 4 windmill-like solar arrays were attached to the Apollo telescope mount. Observations of the Sun were one of this Spacelab program's primary achievements. Over 30 years, NASA's space shuttle fleet, Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, flew 135 missions and carried 355 different people to space. Humanity's first reusable spacecraft, the Space Shuttle, carried people into orbit repeatedly, launched, recovered, and repaired satellites, conducted cutting-edge research, and built the largest structure in space, the International Space Station. The shuttle brought about the first women into space, the Hubble Space Telescope, and the SO Truss structure, which is the big solar panel on top of the International Space Station. The International Space Station is a model for global cooperation and scientific advancements that is enabling growth of private industry in low Earth orbit and development of new technologies to advance human space exploration. Because molecules and cells behave differently in space, research in microgravity helps advance scientific knowledge. The space station is a U.S. national laboratory which the Center for the Advancement of Science in Space, or the CASIS, manages for research investigations that improve life on Earth. NASA has contracted with commercial companies SpaceX, Orbital ATK, and Sierra Nevada Corporation to deliver science investigations, cargo, and supplies to the crews living in space. And soon, Boeing and SpaceX will transport astronauts to and from the station. The Russians sent Sputnik 2, carrying a dog named Laika, into space, and its Soyuz 11 docked with the Salyut 1 habitable module in June of 1971. The Chinese Shenzhou 2 mission, carrying a monkey, a dog, and a rabbit, was in January of 2001, with the Shenzhou 9 docking about 13 years later. In October of 1957, the Russian satellite Sputnik 1 was the first Earth-made satellite sent into orbit. China's first manned spaceflight was the Shenzhou 5, which was occupied by Yang Luai on October 15th of 2003. The Russians were the very first to send a man into space on April 12th, 1961. They sent Yuri Gagarin in Vostok 1. Present and future plans for space travel. Elon Musk, the owner of the electric car company Tesla and the head of SpaceX, created the BFR, which can be used to dock with the International Space Station to deliver cargo, send satellites into space, and clean up space debris. The BFR also has the potential to take over 100 people and plenty of equipment to start a base on the moon. Not only the moon, but SpaceX plans to send 2 cargo ships to Mars by the year 2020. 2 years later, they plan to send astronauts to the planet on 2 ships. Other space tourism companies, such as Blue Origin, Bigelow Aerospace, and Virgin Galactic, believe that they are on the verge of sending people into space commercially. Blue Origin plans to send people to the Kármán line, which is known as the line between Earth's atmosphere and outer space, in a 530 cubic foot capsule which will be slowed on its descent back to Earth by parachutes. Bigelow Aerospace has a plan to send an inflatable hotel into the moon's orbit by the year 2022. The company partnered with NASA in 2016 to send an inflatable demo pod to be attached to an International Space Station and believes that they can put one into the moon's orbit by 2022. Virgin Galactic wants to send their VSS Unity and White Knight 2 to orbital heights and back to Earth. 700 people have put down a deposit to reserve their $250,000 seat. Manned missions are able to adapt better because humans are better at dealing with problems than machines are. Humans are also better at assessing their surroundings and figuring out what has value and what doesn't. Manned missions also have the ability to grab the public's imagination more than autonomous missions. They inspire people. Human space travel is very dangerous because over time in space, there is a greater chance of bone damage, risk of radiation and cancer, and even risk of death. 18 total people have died in space. 14 of those were in the space shuttle era. The cost of human space travel is tremendously bigger than the cost of autonomous space travel. NASA estimates that about $209 billion have been spent on the shuttle program. The unmanned Messenger was sent on a mission to Mercury for only $446 million. In my opinion, the risk greatly outweighs the cost when it comes to manned space expeditions versus autonomous ones. Although the cost is very hefty, and I could probably never afford it. With how many people have died in space missions, until some new technology surfaces to make space travel a lot safer, I wouldn't trust it and spend my money on it. I would much rather like to watch videos about it in my room.